Welcome to the Jaron Jarvis channel. I am Jaron Jarvis. Today, I would like to introduce to you, I was a game warden in Pennsylvania until we got a call for help that changed my life. Working for the Pennsylvania State Game Commission was usually a pretty boring job. My title was actually Wildlife Conservation Officer, but most people just call it Game Warden because that's way less of a mouthful. My typical duties included making sure hunters and fishers had proper licenses, were following the rules for whatever they were killing, and helping out when a wild animal was found severely injured or was becoming a nuisance in a populated area. Occasionally there would be some excitement. After all, I was technically a cop and was able to act as such. My least favorite form of that excitement was when someone would get lost in the woods. That type of call is what made me trade in my badge and settle for a desk job. Now, the Game Commission is not a search and rescue unit. We do get first aid training, but it's minimal. Most of the time that we're called in to help find a lost hiker, it's because we know the area and how to navigate heavy woods. In this case, myself and Jenny, another game warden, had been called in to help local police handle a call for help in a thick patch of woods that fell in their jurisdiction. Jenny and I arrived at the Dinky police station at around 4 p.m. We were taken back into a conference room where some officers and volunteers had gathered. There was a map of the area pinned to the wall and about a dozen people standing around with coffee in their hands. We introduced ourselves to the sheriff and got down to business. About 40 minutes ago, we got a 911 call that was traced to a cell phone in this area, the sheriff told us while circling a spot on the map with his finger. The caller seemed to be a child, and she didn't give us much to go on. All she could say was that she was lost and needed help before the call cut out. There ain't much out there but trees, hills, and deer shit, so we brought the Game Commission in to help us navigate. We don't have any missing kids reported in the area, so we're assuming her parents are lost out there too. Considering she's the one that called, we're assuming the parents may be injured, so we brought in 2 paramedics to help with the search and have their unit on standby. Everyone ready? Good. Let's roll. Everyone moved toward the door of the conference room, but was halted when the sheriff opened the door to find it blocked by a man with long, stringy hair, a beat-up blue jumpsuit, and a frown on his face. Jesus, what is it, Jethro? The sheriff asked with a hint of annoyance in his voice. Those woods, they ain't empty. Jethro pushed past the sheriff and the few people behind him and hurried over to the map on the wall. There's a house out there. Right about here. He pointed to a spot right in the center of the search area. It's an old hunting cabin. It's not used anymore, abandoned after the owner went insane and killed his wife. She'll be there, I bet, but she won't be alone. There are things that live there. Horrible things that made the man lose his sanity and commit those horrible acts. They'll have the girl, I bet, and God have mercy on her. The sheriff cleared his throat after a few moments of silence. Thank you, Jethro. We'll check the cabin, and we'll be extra careful when we do. Now, if you don't mind, one of the toilets in the holding area backed up, the cell floor needs some mopping. Jethro grunted in agreement and left the room. After the group exchanged looks ranging from "what the fuck was that?" to "holy shit that was creepy," we set off on our task. I spotted Jethro pulling a mop and bucket from a closet as I left the building. Jenny and I were quiet on the short drive to the search area. I was trying to focus on the task ahead, but I think Jenny was shaken up by the janitor's warning. Her knuckles were white as she clenched the steering wheel and she never once took her wide eyes off the road. We reviewed the search area on a map again before splitting into 3 groups of 4 and heading into the woods. The area was silent except for the occasional snapping twig and someone calling out for anyone who needed help. Jenny lead one group and I lead another, with 2 local officers who hunted in the area leading the other 2. I was pretty confident that this operation would run smoothly and end relatively quickly. I was wrong. Search and rescue operations take forever. You have to move slowly so that you can keep an eye out for clues to where the missing person might be, and so you don't trip over a rock or something and break an ankle. All of which isn't a problem because if you're off trail you have to move slowly anyway since the terrain is too rough to move quickly. We only had maybe an hour of daylight left when my group heard a scream. I knew that voice. It was Jenny. Without even thinking, I took off toward the sound. Branches scratched at any exposed skin as I hurtled through the foliage, jumping over any rocks and fallen trees in my way. I don't know how far I ran before I saw her running in my direction. She was still a couple hundred yards away, but I could see that her shirt was ripped open and blood covered her sizable breasts and the sports bra that covered them. Just behind her was a man wearing a Halloween monster mask that looked like a gray-skinned demon with no eyes. He was carrying a knife that flung red liquid all around as he ran after my coworker. I called out to Jenny while I wrestled my gun from its holster. She looked relieved for a brief moment before she tripped and hit the ground hard. The man was on top of her in an instant, and thrusted the knife into her head the moment he made contact. I fired at him, hitting him square in the chest, but it didn't seem to affect him physically at all. He took off into the trees, and I rushed to Jenny's side. She was clearly dead, and I took a moment to mourn her as the rest of the group caught up with me. We tried to call for help, but there was no cell phone reception out here and I had dropped the walkie-talkie in my haste to find Jenny. We were alone out there with a killer and who knows how many bodies. The other members of my group wanted to bail, but I insisted we go on. There was a little girl out there, all alone as far as we knew, and in serious danger with that psycho running around. I was a law enforcement officer, and it was my duty to protect her. I'm pretty sure they only agreed to stay with me because I had a gun, but they agreed nonetheless. We figured out where we were on the map and continued our mission. A short while later, just as the last rays of sunlight were streaming through the leaves around us, we came across a dilapidated cabin. We searched the perimeter, calling out for the little girl and keeping our eyes peeled for any sign of her, before deciding to check inside the rundown building. My stomach churned as I turned the knob and swung the door open, its rusted hinges squealing loudly as they moved. The air inside was dusty and hot. The only furniture in the darkened living area was a dirty sofa, an overturned broken table, and a busted lamp. We stepped inside after pulling out our flashlights and shining them around the floor to make sure it wasn't rotted through anywhere. After taking a few steps across the threshold, we were hit with the strong stench of rotten meat. I managed to keep my stomach contents, but one of the volunteers wasn't so lucky. He threw up just behind the sofa after muttering "oh my god" a couple times. He tried holding his nose and moving forward, but after puking twice more, I sent him to keep watch outside. I called out for the little girl a few times while we searched every nook and cranny of the lower level, but got no response. We were inspecting a small bedroom when a loud groaning noise emanated from below. I didn't see any doors while we were looking around. One volunteer spoke with a shaky voice, "I don't think this place has a basement. There could be a hatch somewhere, probably in the living room. Let's go," I commanded as I led the way back into the main room of the cabin. I checked on the woozy volunteer outside as the other two moved the sofa and pulled up the worn area rug that laid beneath it. There it was, among the wooden floorboards that were protected from a thick layer of dust by the rug, a hatch to the floor below. I lifted the door and shined my light through the hole. There was a ladder that led down, and it looked relatively sturdy. I put my flashlight in my mouth and lowered myself through the opening. The other two volunteers followed suit. The basement seemed to be as large as the house above, and had a dirt floor and stone walls. I was checking behind an old furnace when the volunteer outside let out a yell. Heavy footsteps pounded on the floor above. Just as I motioned for the other two volunteers to cover their lights, a figure dropped through the opening to the basement. He landed in a squatting position, then straightened up and presented the bloody knife. One of the volunteers illuminated his mask with their flashlight. The beam made the empty eye sockets look deeper and more menacing than before. The man took a step forward before a long, pale arm reached around the ladder and grabbed his leg. It pulled him to the floor and into the shadows on the other side of the room. We ran for the ladder as we heard our would-be assailant scream. I'll never forget the sounds of his bones breaking one by one. The first volunteer cleared the opening above and the second was halfway up the ladder when the hatch slammed shut. I let out a stream of cuss words as the second volunteer dropped to the ground and screamed. We stood back to back, shining our flashlights around us trying to find the thing that nabbed our attacker. The silence became deafening as we frantically swung the lights over old furniture and beat-up boxes. We couldn't see or hear any further danger, but we knew it was there. After an eternity, there was a short thud followed by the basement flooding with light. Over by the fuse box stood a creature that was at least 7 feet tall. It was hunched over slightly, and I could make out every bone and muscle alone its slender, naked body. It had large black eyes, but nothing else on its face or head. Its arms were so long that its claw-tipped fingers touched the ground next to its claw-tipped toes, and each one had 2 elbows that seemingly couldn't decide which way to point. The monster's pale skin revealed that this was the thing that rendered the murderer to the pile of meat that now laid in the corner of the room. I drew my gun and started firing while the volunteer scrambled back up the ladder and pushed at the hatch. My hands shook so badly that I couldn't hit my target, which had turned its back to me and bent down as if to shield itself. The volunteer shouted victoriously as he lifted the hatch and made his exit. I climbed the ladder faster than I've ever done anything. As soon as I cleared the opening, I ran smack into the back of the volunteer. He stood there in shock, staring at the body of the one who had escaped before the door swung shut. He looked like he could be sleeping, except for the gaping hole in his stomach and the jagged slash across his throat. Crouched over him was another beast. This one was about as tall as the average man and was built like a bodybuilder. Thick, pulsing muscles rippled over black skin as it assumed an attack position on all fours. Its blood-red eyes narrowed as it smiled, its mouth stretching impossibly wide and revealing what looked like hundreds of razor-sharp teeth. The monster growled, then spoke with a voice that sounded like gravel rubbing together. More food. Warm urine soaked my goose-bumped skin as my bladder let loose all over the front of my pants. The remaining volunteer and I sprang into action at the same time. The creature was blocking the front door, so we scrambled to the bedroom and slammed the door behind us. I pushed the dresser in front of the entrance, and the volunteer pushed the bed against that. There was only one window in the room, and we frantically tried to pry it open as the beast pounded against the door. I prayed that our barricade would hold as I heard the wood split. My prayers were answered when the banging stopped. It was followed by a loud yelp and what sounded like something crashing around the living room. After what seemed like forever, the noises stopped completely. Whatever was happening seemed to be over. The volunteer and I stood in shocked silence, breathing heavily and afraid to move. We both stared at the barricade. Part of me wanted to push past it and run for the hills while it seemed to be safe, but the other part was resigned to staying put. A few minutes passed quietly before we heard light footsteps approach the door. "It's okay," the muffled girl's voice called, "you can come out now. It's safe, I promise." I had to work a bit to convince the volunteer that it was okay, but eventually I was able to talk him into coming out of our hiding place with me. When we cleared the furniture and opened what was left of the door, we were greeted by a young girl in shorts and a dirty blue shirt. She was holding hands with the pale creature from the basement. Upon seeing this, the volunteer ripped my gun from my hip and fired at the creature. It responded by stepping in front of the girl, reaching out one of its long arms, and snapping the volunteer's neck. When the man fell to the floor, the creature looked at me as if it was sizing me up. A small slit formed near the bottom of its face. It opened a tiny mouth, about as long as a house key, and bared its small, knobby teeth at me. The little girl stepped out from behind the monster and craned her neck to look at it. "It's okay now, buddy. We're okay." The beast patted her head lightly without taking its eyes off of me. It slowly took a step toward me and leaned so that its face was level with mine. In a voice that sounded like it just inhaled helium deeply, it said, "Take girl home." It put the girl's hand in mine, patted her head again, and retreated back to the basement. It wiggled its fingers at the girl, who giggled at the goodbye. After making sure that she wasn't hurt and giving her a granola bar and some water, I lead the girl out of the woods. Her parents, who had also gotten lost while searching for the girl when they got separated, were waiting for us at the parking lot. They were accompanied by what I'm assuming was every cop, paramedic, and fireman in the county. The search for the two missing rescue groups was called off for the night and resumed when daylight returned. No one could find the cabin again for some reason, but several bodies were discovered. I told the investigators about Jenny's demise and finding the little girl, but kept my encounter with the monsters to myself. They questioned me for a long time about how I managed to get separated from my group, but I managed to keep my story straight while insisting that I just lost track of them while running to help my fallen comrade. Once they let me go, satisfied that I wasn't involved in any wrongdoing, I told my boss that I had had enough of the game commission. I never wanted to be a pencil pusher, but it's a hell of a lot safer. X.